federal judges are assisting the Trump administration in violating the constitutional rights of protesters, specifically their right to assemble and protest. There's freedom of speech. And this is based on investigative reporting done by ProPublica. This reporting indicates that federal authorities arresting protesters in Portland, Oregon on offenses as minor as failing to obey an order to get off a sidewalk on federal property, and then tell them they can't protest anymore as a condition for release from jail. So they'll get arrested for allegedly failing to move off of the sidewalk, and then they will not be released unless they agree to avoid protesting moving forward. So at least 12 protesters arrested in recent weeks have been specifically barred from attending protests or demonstrations as they await trials on federal misdemeanor charges. One release document instructs, do not participate in any protests, demonstrations, rallies, assemblies while this case is pending. So John, I have more details on this. I wanted to get your thoughts.
Well, I mean, you'll be shocked to find out I'm against it. But my initial knee-jerk reaction is how can you make your release contingent on giving up one of your constitutional rights? And then I realized, okay, so there are instances where that does exist. For instance, you could potentially be barred from owning a firearm based on your experience committing violent crimes or something like that. Roger Stone, for instance, wasn't allowed to continue going on Twitter because he was rampantly, trying to intimidate witnesses and things like that. But as a general case, this sort of extreme light misdemeanor, meaning that one of your core rights, one of the first ones that you have, could be taken away, is so obviously unacceptable that I can only imagine what the First Amendment warriors in the independent dark web are gonna do when they find out about it. Because free speech rights are being violated, and not just some sort of general speech, but literally your ability to do political activism, to protest for what you believe. I mean, they're gonna be so worked. Obviously, it's ridiculous. They're not gonna care at all because this isn't about a right-wing speaker getting a check for $50,000 for doing like an hour speech. This is about real people actually fighting for change. But how is this acceptable? How can this continue? This is the sort of thing that happens on like judge TV shows. These sorts of ridiculous stipulations before you, but this isn't a TV show, this is reality.
Right, and these judge TV shows have to do with civil suits and nonsense. This has to do with federal agents arresting protesters on ridiculous charges, including, literally failing to move off of a sidewalk. I mean, is there evidence that the protester heard? Was it a chaotic scene and maybe the protester didn't hear? And I just think that if you take a step back and you look at the broader picture of the tactics being used by authorities, everything is specifically being done to intimidate people and to prevent them from feeling comfortable in practicing their constitutional rights. We are supposed to have the right to protest. We are supposed to have the right to voice our opinions. This is a perfect example of our free speech being violated. And I'm not the one saying that. You have constitutional experts, constitutional lawyers who spoke to ProPublica for this investigative report, and they make it abundantly clear that this does in fact violate the constitutional rights of these protesters. So when you see these federal agents dragging people into unmarked cars, that is a form of intimidation that is done to send a message to other protesters. Hey, you should be afraid. You shouldn't come out here and protest. You could be next. When you see this type of behavior, think about it. If you're one of the protesters who was arrested by a federal agent on nonsense charges and you're detained during a pandemic, it's terrifying. You don't know when you're gonna get out, and they dangle your free speech rights right above you and tell you, look, you gotta give up your rights in order for us to release you. You gotta agree to never go to another protest again. And I honestly don't blame the protesters who do take that deal. Who would wanna be held in federal detention? Well, I wouldn't want that.
Yeah, well, and especially as you mentioned, during a pandemic, it's being taken in is a threat to your life. Being held there for longer is a continuing threat to your life. But honestly, I would wonder if someone, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a lot of things, I'm especially not a lawyer, but if someone took this sort of deal, obviously, watch out for yourself. But like my knee-jerk reaction would be, go back to the protests. And if they take you in for violating it, then I would try to send that up the judicial system as far as I can. Like let's have an actual battle about some judge's ability to strip away your First Amendment rights so that you aren't held for committing some misdemeanor. I mean, God only knows what's going on in America. I would assume that couldn't possibly stand, but in 2020, who knows?
And I want to be super clear. The people that we're talking about here have been charged with federal misdemeanors, okay? So again, I give you the example of failing to move off the sidewalk because first of all, that's one of the examples given by ProPublica. That was a literal federal misdemeanor charge that someone's dealing with. But we're not having a conversation about people who are actually harming others, causing any type of violence. These are people who really, I think should absolutely be allowed to go back and protest. I want to give you some specific examples. So as ProPublica reports, those terms were given to me, according to one of the protesters, after being in a holding cell for 14 hours, okay? So this individual was actually charged on July 24th for failing to obey a lawful order. It was pretty cut and dry. Just, these are your conditions for getting out of here. If I didn't take it, I would still be in holding. It wasn't really an option in my eyes. Now, constitutional lawyers said conditioning release from jail on a promise to stop joining protests were overly broad and almost certainly a violation of the First Amendment right to free assembly. And there's also some confusion over whether federal agents will finally leave Portland. I want to just quickly talk about that as well, because some of the local politicians in Portland are arguing that, okay, we've finally struck a deal with Vice President Mike Pence, and he has agreed that the Department of Homeland Security will pull these federal agents out of Portland. But that actually is not the case. So for instance, Oregon Governor Kate Brown announced that the Trump administration has agreed to begin withdrawing federal tactical teams from Portland, Oregon, which for weeks has been the site of violent clashes between officers and protesters. But officers from Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, were allegedly going to start pulling, their agents out tomorrow on Thursday, but the Department of Homeland Security is expected to retain a presence in the city, however, and the Trump administration pushed back on the suggestion that agents would begin leaving as early as Thursday. Brown said a limited contingent of federal officials will stay focused on protecting the interior of the federal courthouse that has been at the center of the unrest. But DHS Secretary Chad Wolf pushed back even more aggressively, arguing, and this is a direct quote, the department will continue to maintain our current augmented federal law enforcement personnel in Portland until we are assured that the Hatfield Federal Courthouse and other federal properties will no longer be attacked, and that the seat of justice in Portland will remain secure. As we know, and we've seen in multiple stories, federal agents have no interest in simply protecting federal property. They have pepper sprayed peaceful protesters, including Vietnam veterans. The Wall of Moms have been met with extreme violence at the hands of these federal agents. They're absolutely lying about why they're there and what they're doing, and they're only escalating the violence in the area.